Somewhere on the shore of a shrinking lake in what is now southern New Mexico, a woman picked up a small child, settled them on one hip, and set off north across the mud. The walk covered more than a mile and a half out and back and left over 400 footprints. She put the child down at least once on the way. You can see the little prints beside the big ones where it happened. In the hours between the outward journey and the return, a giant ground sloth crossed the same ground. Its tracks show it rearing up on its hind legs, turning, sniffing the air where the human scent still hung. A Colombian mammoth crossed the trackway too and paid it no attention whatsoever. That mud is 22,000 years old. These were people who hunted mammoth and ate it as a staple. And we know that from the chemistry in the bones of a baby buried in Montana. They trapped foxes and lynx for fur and sewed tailored clothing with needles made from the animal's own bones. They wore beads. In Alaska, they were catching salmon 11,500 years ago and burying their children under the hearth. In Brazil, 9,000 years ago, they buried a severed head with its own amputated hands laid over the face. A handful of Amazonian peoples carry a genetic signature that links them to Aboriginal Australians, and nobody can explain it. The single most famous site in this entire story is, as of this year, the subject of an open and extremely bad-tempered fight in the pages of science. So who were they? Where did they come from, and by what route? What did they eat? What did they make? How did they bury their dead? And why is this, of all the questions in world prehistory, the one archaeologists have been arguing about most bitterly for the best part of a century? This is the epic story of the first Americans. In 2007, 3 divers mapping flooded cave passages north of Tulum in the Yucatán came out of a tunnel into open water and found nothing beneath them. Their torches wouldn't reach the bottom. They had surfaced into a chamber 30 meters deep, half a kilometer in from the nearest entrance, and they named it Hoyo Negro, the black hole. When they got down there, the floor was covered in bones. Gomphotheres, elephant relatives with tusks in the lower jaw, 2 species of giant ground sloth, saber-toothed cats, 26 large animals in all, and not one of them has existed for 12,000 years. Lying among them, almost complete, was a girl. She was 15 or 16, about 1.5 meters tall, and she died somewhere between 13 and 12,000 years ago. The divers called her Naia, after the water nymphs. When she was alive, the sea was 100 meters lower and the cave system was dry. She was walking underground in the dark, a long way in, looking for water, most likely, and the floor gave out beneath her. Her skull is long and narrow, with a small face, wide-set eyes, a low forehead, and forward projecting teeth. For decades, that shape was the single biggest objection to the standard story, because it looks almost nothing like the skull of a modern Native American. A serious body of opinion held that these narrow-faced Paleo-Americans were in earlier and separate migration, later replaced by everybody else. Then a team got DNA out of one of her molars. Her mitochondrial lineage turned out to be an ordinary one, shared with indigenous people living across the Americas today. She belongs to the same population as everyone else who was here, which only pushes the question back a step. Where did that population come from, and how did a teenage girl end up dying in a cave in the Yucatán? For that, you have to go north, a very long way north. The Americas were the last great landmass our species reached. Humans were in Australia by around 50,000 years ago and across most of Eurasia long before that. But 2 continents running from the Arctic to Cape Horn, roughly a third of the world's habitable land, stayed empty of people until very late indeed. The reason is geography, and to get there on foot, you had to cross Beringia, the whole region, and between the Lena River in Russia and the Mackenzie in Canada, with the Bering Land Bridge at its heart. Bridge is a terrible word for it. This was a continental shelf, exposed when so much of the world's water was locked up in ice that sea level dropped by well over 100 meters. Beringia covered something like 3 million square kilometers, and the connection between Asia and America was over 1,000 kilometers wide from north to south. Anyone crossing it had no sense of crossing anything. It was simply the country they lived in. Most of it was unglaciated because it was too dry for glaciers to form. What grew there was the Mammoth steppe, a cold, arid grassland with no modern equivalent, grazed by mammoth, steppe bison, horse, and caribou. Sediment cores from the floor of the Bering Sea complicate that picture, though. They hold pollen and insect fossils from shrub tundra and from spruce, birch, willow, and alder, which suggests pockets of wetter, brushier, sheltered country in the lowlands. places where people could get firewood, and where the browsing animals were. Those pockets matter because of what the genetics says happened next. Every genome study of the last decade agrees on the broad shape. The ancestors of Native Americans separated from their East Asian and Siberian relatives somewhere around 25 to 20,000 years ago. Then comes a long silence. The divergence from Asia is early. The archaeology south of the ice sheets is late. The leading explanation for that gap is the Beringian Standstill, a population that moved into Beringia, got sealed off behind the ice and the cold, and stayed there for thousands of years, slowly accumulating the genetic signature that every indigenous American population carries today. We have a face for those people, after a fashion. In 2013, at a site in the Tanana Valley of central Alaska, known to the local Middle Tanana Athabascan community as Zasa Na, archaeologists excavated the burial of two infant girls around 11,500 years old. The elder was given the name Zak Iti Anin Tiede Gai, Sunrise Girl Child. Her genome belonged to a population nobody knew existed. She wasn't ancestral to later Native Americans, and she wasn't from some separate migration either. She sat on a sister branch, the ancient Beringians, which split from the ancestors of everyone else in the Americas between about 22 and 18,000 years ago, and then stayed in the north while the others went south. So there was a founding population. It sat up there a long time. Then it fractured. Forget dates for a moment. What did these people actually have? At a site called Prele in Converse County, Wyoming, a group butchered a young Columbian mammoth about 12,900 years ago and camped around a line of hearths. Excavation has produced some 45,000 artifacts from that one camp. Among them, 7 millimeters long, is a tube of bone with grooves cut round the outside. It is the oldest bead in the Americas. Mass spectrometry on its collagen identified the raw material as a hare's foot bone. The same camp gave up 32 fragments of eyed bone needles. When those were run through the same technique in 2024, they came back as red fox, hare, and cats, bobcat, lynx, mountain lion, possibly even the extinct American cheetah. The argument is that those particular bones were lying around the camp because they had arrived still attached to the pelts, which means people were trapping fur-bearing predators for their skins rather than their meat, and sewing them into tailored clothing. It is the closest we will ever come to seeing what one of these people wore. Back at White Sands, alongside the trackways, the team have found long, parallel drag marks dated to around 22,000 years ago. They read them as travois, simple wooden frames dragged across the ground to shift a load. The human prints running beside them include a lot of small ones, children walking with the adults doing the hauling. Their tools could be extraordinary. The largest point from the East Wenatchee Cache in Washington State is 23 centimeters of white agate, more than twice the length of a normal Clovis point, and under the microscope it shows no wear at all. Nobody ever used it for anything. That cache also held 12 rods of mammoth or mastodon bone, beveled at both ends, some incised with a pattern the analysts describe as a zipper. The Finn cache from the Wyoming-Utah-Idaho borders contains 56 pieces, 31 of them big percussion-flaked bifaces, including a round platter-shaped one of obsidian 21 centimeters across. Almost every object in it is coated in red ochre. Diet varied enormously across the continent. Anzac 1 is the only Clovis individual ever found, an 18-month-old boy from Montana who was still nursing when he died, which means the isotopes locked into his bones record his mother's diet. Roughly 40% of it was mammoth, with elk, bison, and the extinct camel. Making up most of the rest, small mammals contributed essentially nothing. Her isotopic signature comes out closest to the scimitar cat, an animal understood to have specialized in mammoth. 2,000 kilometers west, the Paisley Caves in the Oregon desert have produced over 1,800 desiccated human and animal droppings, and the human ones tell a completely different story. Grass seeds, berries, roots, rodents, hares, fish, sage grouse, bison hair, and beetles. Pollen inside them suggests people pass through in spring and early summer. In Alaska, the hearth at Sunrise Girl Child's camp held more than 300 salmon bones. Ancient DNA identified them as chum salmon that had run up from the sea, which makes it the oldest evidence of salmon fishing anywhere in the Americas. An obsidian flake from the same site was sourced to Hoodoo Mountain in the Yukon, 600 kilometers away, and in the dry caves of the northern Great Basin, the perishable things survive. In 1938, Luther Cressman pulled dozens of sandals out of Fort Rock Cave in Oregon, from beneath a layer of ash thrown out by the eruption that made Crater Lake. They are twined from shredded sagebrush bark over 5 rope warps with a flat sole and a flap across the toes. Directly dated, they run from about 10.5 to 9,000 years old, which makes them the oldest directly dated footwear in the world. None of that was supposed to exist. In 1927, near Folsom, New Mexico, excavators found a stone point lodged among the ribs of an extinct bison, which settled a question that had been open for decades. People had been here during the Ice Age. 2 years later, at Blackwater Draw, near the town of Clovis, tools turned up alongside Columbian mammoth bone. The points were large and beautifully made, with a channel, or flute, struck off each face at the hafted base. Clovis points turned out to be everywhere, from Washington State to Florida, made to the same template. Nothing older was accepted anywhere in the hemisphere. So Clovis became the founding population, arriving down a corridor between the melting ice sheets, ancestral to everything that followed. That model held for 60 years and was defended with real ferocity. Careers were damaged over it. 2 things brought it down. The first was Monte Verde in southern Chile, where from 1977 Tom Dillehay excavated a site buried under a peat bog that had preserved wood, cordage, and hide. There was a tent-like structure some 20 meters long, framed with logs and staked poles, apparently divided inside for separate families. Hearths, mastodon remains, a human footprint in hardened clay, wads of chewed seaweed carried up from the coast. Radiocarbon put it at about 14,500 years old, and in 1997, a delegation of prominent archaeologists, several of them skeptics, went to see it and endorsed the dating. That was the moment the profession changed its mind. The second was radiocarbon precision turned on Clovis itself. A 2020 study redated material from 10 Clovis sites and found the whole complex fitted inside a window of roughly 13,050 to 12,750 years ago. 300 years. Whatever Clovis was, it arrived already fully formed, which looks far more like something that developed among people already living here than like a founding culture walking in from outside. The floodgates opened. At Paisley, coprolites containing human DNA date to around 14,300 years ago. At Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, Nipehe to the Nez Perce, hearths, blades, and butchered bone run between roughly 16.5 and 15,000 years, with a pit holding 14 stem points. And then there is the mud at White Sands. Those footprints were first dated in 2021 using seeds of an aquatic plant and came out at 23 to 21,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, when the ice sheets were at their greatest extent and the route south should have been sealed. The objection was immediate and serious. Aquatic plants can absorb dissolved carbon from old groundwater and read as artificially ancient. So the site was dated again. In 2023, a team published radiocarbon ages on terrestrial conifer pollen, which has no such problem, alongside luminescence dating of quartz grains. Both landed in the same range. In June 2025, a third, independent team traced stream deposits dated to around 22,000 years old, across to the footprint layers a mile away. Same answer, 3 methods, 3 teams. Some researchers still argue for younger ages in parts of the basin, but no other claim in this field has survived that level of scrutiny, and the tracks themselves are astonishing. Children jumping between mammoth prints, a toddler splashing in a puddle that had formed inside a sloth track, a group stalking a giant ground sloth, stepping deliberately into its footprints, while other human prints hold position at a safe distance, and the sloth's tracks record it rearing and swinging its forelimbs in what the excavators call flailing circles, which is what a 2.5-meter animal with claws like a wolverine does when it is cornered. For most of the 20th century, the answer was the ice-free corridor, a gap that opened between the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets through what is now Alberta. In 2016, a team cored lake beds in the narrowest bottleneck of that corridor to work out when life came back to it. The corridor was physically opened by around 13,000 years ago, but until roughly 12,600 it was barren. No vegetation, no bison, no mammoth, nothing to eat for 1,500 kilometers. Clovis people were living south of the ice more than 4 centuries before it became passable. Imagine walking that gauntlet with children and no food at either end. It doesn't work, and it works even less for anyone at White Sands 7,000 years earlier. The alternative is the coastal route, the Kelp Highway. Kelp forests run in a near-continuous band round the North Pacific Rim from Japan to Baja, California, holding the same shellfish, fish, seabirds, and marine mammals the whole way, so nobody following them had to learn a new way of feeding themselves. A road at sea level, around the ice rather than through it. The California Channel Islands were never joined to the mainland, so the people whose remains turn up there arrive by boat, and a hearth on Tierra Island in British Columbia dates to around 14,000 years ago. The problem is obvious. That coastline is now seabed, and the earlier the occupation, the further offshore the evidence sits. In the late summer of a year, around 11,500 years ago, at that Alaskan camp beside the Tanana, 3 children died within a few weeks of each other. An infant of about 12 weeks and a baby who died shortly before birth were buried together in a pit dug beneath the central cooking hearth of the house. Both were covered in red ochre. With them went decorated dart points and antler rods. Their families filled the pit in, built a new hearth directly on top of it, and went on cooking there. Then the 3rd child died, a 3-year-old. That child was cremated in the same hearth, the pit was filled, and the house was abandoned. The Healy Lake tribe named the child Zasa Chigtsenin, Upward Sun River Mouth Child. 3 children, 1 household, 1 summer, at the time of year when food should have been at its most plentiful. You wonder what the surviving adults thought was wrong with that place. Anzac is the only Clovis burial ever found, an 18-month-old under more than 100 objects covered in ochre. And the caches are full of ochre too. Whether those were stores meant to be collected later or offerings meant to stay in the ground is a question nobody has answered. By the early Holocene, mortuary practice in South America had become genuinely elaborate. At Lapa do Santo, a rock shelter in the Lagoa Santa Karst of east-central Brazil, 26 burials span 2 very different phases. Between about 10,600 and 10,300 years ago, bodies went into shallow graves intact, capped with limestone blocks. From around 9,600, the treatment changes completely, and bodies are reduced before burial by dismemberment, defleshing, and burning. The most striking is Burial 26, directly dated to between 9,400 and 9,100 years ago. It consists of a skull, its jaw, and the top 6 vertebrae of the neck. There are cut marks on the mandible and on the 6th vertebra. Both hands had been amputated and laid over the face. The right hand across the left side, fingertips pointing at the chin, the left hand across the right side, fingertips pointing at the forehead. Strontium isotopes say the man was local, which rules out a defeated enemy and a war trophy. It is the oldest decapitation known in the Americas by 6,000 years. 4 meters down, engraved into the bedrock of the same shelter, is the oldest rock art in South America. And there was no cemetery at Lapa do Santo. People lived and cooked directly on top of their dead. In 1940, excavators at Spirit Cave in Nevada recovered a man wrapped in tulle matting, wearing moccasins, under a rabbit skin blanket, partially mummified, with 67 objects around him. He is about 10,700 years old. The Fallon Paiute Shoshone call him the storyteller, and they asked for him back in 1997. The request was refused, and what followed took 20 years and more than $300,000 in tribal legal costs. The same fight was running over the man found in 1996 on the Columbia River at Kennewick, the ancient one, nearly 300 bones with a stone point healed into his hip, around 9,000 years old. It was the Naia argument all over again. His skull didn't look modern, so a group of scientists sued for the right to study him, arguing he wasn't covered by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Both cases broke the same way. In 2015, the Ancient One's genome came back closest of all to the Colville and the other plateau tribes, the people who had been saying exactly that for 2 decades. He was reburied in February 2017. Spirit Cave was sequenced under an agreement negotiated with the tribe before any sampling. If the storyteller was Native American, he would go home. He was. He was returned in 2016 and buried privately in 2018. Many indigenous nations also have their own accounts of their origins, which don't involve Beringia. Archaeology can tell you about population movements. It doesn't get to adjudicate anyone's history of themselves, which brings us back to the site that started all of this. In March 2026, a team led by Todd Surovell published the first independent investigation of Monte Verde in nearly 50 years. Citing a volcanic ash layer sitting beneath the archaeological horizon, they argued the landform did not exist 14,500 years ago and that the site could be as young as 4,000. Ancient wood washed down from upstream. The response was blunt. In May, around 30 researchers published 3 commentaries in Science, led by Dillehay, by Michael Waters, and by David Meltzer. Surovell's team had spent a few hours in the field and excavated nothing inside the original site area, so they were never in a position to examine the stratigraphy. One published assessment called the geological work egregiously poor. I'd be wary of anyone with a settled view on this yet. What the row shows is how thin the evidence base still is. A discipline in which one waterlogged site in Patagonia can carry this much weight has a sampling problem. One thread refuses to be tidied away. In 2015, researchers analyzing DNA from Amazonian peoples found a small but robust affinity to indigenous Australians, Melanesians, and Andaman Islanders. Nothing in the known peopling of the Americas explains it. They called the hypothetical source population Y. It was tempting to write it off as an artifact, but in 2018, the same signal turned up in an individual who lived in Brazil 11,700 years ago, and in 2021, another team found it far more widely spread than anyone expected. Nobody thinks anyone paddled across the Pacific. The likeliest reading is that this ancestry came through Beringia with everyone else in a subgroup that reached South America and then dissolved, leaving 1 or 2% of itself in the genomes of its descendants and nothing else at all. Once south of the ice, the expansion was astonishingly fast. Ancient genomes from opposite ends of the hemisphere are closely related, which means people covered 16,000 kilometers from Alaska to Patagonia in a handful of centuries. They reached Tierra del Fuego, the end of the road, by 12,700 years ago. Then, the mountains and forests that made the continent so rich began to work the other way, isolating the people living in them. Over the following 10,000 years, the 4 founding South American lineages declined by between 38 and 80%, narrowing the diversity of their immune genes. Then, Europeans arrived, carrying diseases against which that narrowed repertoire offered very little. And yet the line held. Every indigenous nation in the Americas today descends from those first populations. I think about the trackway a lot. 22,000 years, and what survives is a person carrying a toddler, putting them down for a moment, picking them up again, and walking on.